Ovo je 5. sajam Bosanskohercegovačke knjige u Göteborgu. Ja sam Midhatom Ajanović i ja ću pokušati da predstavim jednog vrlo neobičnog, zanimljivog pisca. Ovaj sajam ima u fokusu pisce koji djeluju u takozvanoj književnoj dijaspori i moj današnji gost i naš današnji gost Kevin Sullivan je također pisac u dijaspori, ali malo neobičan pisac u dijaspori. On je naime škotski pisac koji piše sjajne knjige na engleskom i koje se objavljuju u mainstreamu, ali on živi u Sarajevu. Dakle, on je u književnoj dijaspori u Sarajevu, za razliku od mnogih od nas koji smo iz Sarajeva i iz drugih dijelova Bosne u književnoj dijaspori. Kevin je pisac koji živi u Sarajevu u dijaspori, u škotskoj književnoj dijaspori. Najviše ćemo razgovarati o knjizi The Longest Winter, njegovoj knjizi u kojoj je opisao ratno stanje u Sarajevu tokom 1992. i 1993. ali ćemo govoriti i o njegovim ostalim knjigama, vrlo zanimljivim kriminalističkim knjigama koji su situirane u jedan neobičan milje u vrijeme špansko-američkog rata krajem 18. i početkom 19. stoljeća. U svakom slučaju, Kevin Sullivan će nam reći više o svom radu i svojim književnim idejama, svojoj književnoj svakodnevnici. Kevin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ayan. I have to confess that after more than 30 years of association with Bosnia and Herzegovina, my capacity to speak in the appropriate language, I'm afraid, is very, very limited. However, I did understand your introduction and it was very generous. Thank you. And it's great to be here.
Thank you to you. And we are not going to discuss language problems. I'm sitting in Gothenburg. The weather outside is very nice, which is quite unusual for Sweden. How it is in Sarajevo?
Well, it's today very overcast, quite miserable. And I was looking out the window earlier and I said to Maria that the weather is perfectly Scottish today. We could be in Glasgow, but it's been unusually mild, as many people watching will know.
You mentioned Maria. It is your wife, Maria Fekete Sullivan, who is also a writer specialized for literature for children. And Kevin, can we start from the beginning? What background are you coming from? What books did you read in your childhood? What films did you see? On what point of your life did you develop your interest in artistic expression? Tell us something basic about yourself.
Well, as soon as I left Glasgow after graduating, I went abroad. It had always been my intention to live overseas. And there's a scene in the movie Gandhi where the American foreign correspondent reads a story down the telephone line about a demonstration that had been organized by Indian nationalists. And I remember thinking, that is really what I want to do. I want to be on the other end of a telephone line, reading a story about something interesting that's happening somewhere exciting in the world. So I wanted to do two things. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And after a period of being a foreign correspondent in the classical way, I wanted to become a novelist who used my experiences as a foreign correspondent. I worked in the Far East for a long time. I lived in Tokyo for 7 years. I worked for The Guardian while I was in Tokyo. And I covered events, for example, in South Korea, also Tiananmen Square in China in 1989. But to be honest, when I came to former Yugoslavia in 1991, I was not a particularly experienced war correspondent. I was in Dubrovnik in October 1991 during the siege, and then I was in Sarajevo in 92 and 93 One of the things that I would say is a theme that runs through what I try to do as a novelist is to show that the experience of conflict, A, is more complex, and B, is more surprising than many people might imagine. And by that, I mean, when you see a war film and you see people running for shelter, you think that is the sum total of that experience. But the reality is, as you know, that there are many other factors that are involved, and many of them are not dramatic, not particularly related to the conflict. And one of the things that people will always say about the experience of being under siege in Sarajevo, for example, was that the daily grind, the things that happened between the drama were very often the things that were hardest to come to terms with. So that's where I came from in terms of journalism. In terms of art, I would say that again, the same theme. I always enjoyed reading about events which go beneath the surface of historical events. One of my favorite examples of that is the opening of either Scarlet and Black or the Charterhouse at Parma. I think it's the Charterhouse at Parma, which begins at the Battle of Waterloo. And the central character doesn't know what's going on. He is completely clueless. He's in the middle of the battle. He sees people coming past him in horseback cavalry. He doesn't know if they're French or Prussian or British. And that always struck me as being the most interesting insight on conflict, that if you're in the middle of it, it's only afterwards people know the result, and it seems very simple, almost preordained. But at the time, it's by no means clear. And I always enjoyed literature that explored that type of paradox.
Yeah, it can be a typical example for existentialism. Like Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, we are the actors in our life, the actors who doesn't know the screenplay. But the way you did get into literature is very interesting story, tragical story. Basically, you were wounded, and then you started to compose your first draft to what would become a novel, The Longest Winter.
Yeah, I was wounded at the end of January in 1993, and I wrote in Gorny Vakov. I drove over a landmine, and I was quite badly injured. Both my legs were broken. I wrote the first draft of The Longest Winter in Alipashno-Polje in the spring of 1993, and that was something I was able to do when, due to the enforced circumstances, I wasn't mobile, but I was able to sit. And that was a privilege to have that experience because I wasn't working as a correspondent. I was simply recovering from injuries. And I learned a little bit about the solidarity of the people of Sarajevo during that period. The neighbors were helping one another. There was a very strong atmosphere of community coming together. And as you know very well, that was by no means simply one community. That was members of all the communities of former Yugoslavia found themselves in the same position, in the same place, and behaved with tremendous decency. And that was one of the things which I hope to have been able to have put in The Longest Winter, which is the shorthand of the conflict. The Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks, the shorthand does not do justice either to the complexity of the actual conflict or to human nature, which of course is so varied. And when you witness kindness among people who may have all manner of different backgrounds, then you simply see human nature at its best. That's not to put a sort of lyrical, unrealistically wonderful rose-tinted view, but I think that was genuinely something that it was a privilege to witness in Sarajevo in 1993.
I was particularly impressed by your feeling and sense for details. I was there. I was there, and I found it. I found myself in the book on the page 10. You wrote about Oslobođenje daily paper, and you wrote they are still working in the basement.
Yes. Right. Well,
and your book, The Longest Winter, we talk about, combines different genres. It is a historical chronicle, an action novel, in a way a melodrama, but above all, it's a historical record of events in Sarajevo in 1992 and 1993, such as the assassination of Bosnian Minister Hakija Turajlić, the decisive battle for Otas, a part of Sarajevo, whose fall could easily have been an introduction to the fall of the whole city of Sarajevo. But also it's, as you said, above all, the story of the people who found themselves in Sarajevo, each with their own destiny. Tell us how the idea for this story developed. As far as I know, the book is very much related to your personal history, and I know how it is to write a novel composed of 300 pages. It's not easy way. It's a very long way to go. And what was the power that enabled you to make this book? Besides the solidarity in Sarajevo, everything you went through, what was this decisive factor that make you to make decision to stay in Sarajevo?
Oh, well, I can answer the last question very easily. That was because I got married to Maria, and we decided to stay. So that was a nice result of the overall circumstances, which of course were not very nice. You mentioned there are different. The book can be looked at in different ways as an action, a description of battles and so on, as a historical record. I would say the second part, the historical record, probably emerges from that period when I was recovering, and I was in one apartment in Alpashnopolje, and I wasn't able to go out and do too much. So I was able to view things from a different perspective, a less active perspective, a more dependent perspective. And I think that maybe informs some of the observation. The other aspect, I cover the fighting in Otas right up until the very end, until the withdrawal of the Bosnian army. And the descriptions there are basically develop the descriptions that I reported at the time. And in a way, I'm glad that the experience of being someone who was dependent on others and observed how others behaved was able to leaven the descriptions of running about as a foreign correspondent, because I think we're all familiar with the temptation to make the story one of adventure and excitement, when of course the reality is that it's not all about running about and you know, dodging shrapnel and so on. There are other aspects to this. I think, having said that, one of the things that has always intrigued me, and we see this today, literally today, when we're looking at the prospect of another conflict in Europe, is that one of the unpalatable aspects of conflict is that it's exciting. It is dramatic. It draws people in. And I hate to use this word, but in inverted commas, it's attractive. That's why people can't wait to get into uniform in 1914 and 1939 and march off, because it seems to be glorious and valiant. And I always compare it to heroin. It gives you the most wonderful feeling in the world, and then it kills you. And I felt it was important, and I feel it's important. If you simply say, let's be against war, which one morally should be, you must nonetheless acknowledge it. It's complicated because war can be attractive, war can draw people in. And I wanted to examine the fact that this can appear, for many people, this was the most dramatic thing that ever happened in their lives. And a lot of soldiers from the First World War, for example, looked back with a type of nostalgia for the comradeship they enjoyed in the trenches, even though the trenches were horrendous. So I wanted to explore that. Let's acknowledge the very unpalatable fact that war happens not simply because of political considerations, but because it's easy to get people excited and march them off to war. And it's only afterwards, once the first trolleys are coming back into the shell-shattered hospital, that you then have to confront the fact that it seemed like something dramatic, melodramatic, but the reality is very squalid.
I agree totally. I think about something that happened recently. Interesting dialogue took place at a recent meeting between the German chancellor and the Russian president on the occasion of the Ukraine crisis. The German chancellor said, I quote freely, that Europe would not allow the first war on its soil after the Second World War. The Russian president corrected him, reminding him that there had already been a war in which NATO was bombing one big European city, Belgrade. The chancellor replied that this prevented genocide in Kosovo, as if Bosnia never happened. It is as if the European city of Sarajevo has not been besieged and bombed for almost 4 years. Why politics and the media have created this great amnesia around Bosnia? Why does Bosnia and its people should be expelled from the history? Why should we forget about atrocities and horrible things that happened in Sarajevo during Sarajevo-Srebrenica period in 4 years? Do you have any theory, any conclusion about it, considering your work as a journalist and your work on this particular project, the book, The Longest Winter?
I would say two things there. One is that I always thought of the war in former Yugoslavia as being comparable to the Spanish Civil War and also to the war in Vietnam in terms of the issues that were at stake and the way that those issues were presented. And I remember being in the Holiday Inn at the beginning of 1993, about half a dozen foreign correspondents, and we were complaining about the fact that there was no intervention and that intervention was a moral obligation on the part of the West. And it occurred to me that we were all about the same age and of about the same political persuasion, which you could probably generally say would be liberal, of people who protested against the Vietnam War. And 25 years later, we were in Sarajevo saying this is outrageous, there should be intervention. And I think that made me think of the paradox that you may call for intervention for the purposes of justice and the purposes of peace. It can work out, as it did in Bosnia and Herzegovina, very effectively by stopping the war in 2.5 weeks. Or it could work out, as in Vietnam, or for that matter, Afghanistan, for both the Russians and the Americans, where you end up with 10 years of conflict. These are, again, things that you only know after the event. And after the event, when you know them, you think it must have been like that. But at the time, it's by no means clear how the intervention will work out. On the issue of the collective amnesia, one of the things which, again, all of us are very familiar with this, is that the war in former Yugoslavia was presented in very simplistic terms. A clash of civilizations, for example, the religious affiliation of the parties, the supposed religious affiliation of the parties, because as we know very well, that was a crude shorthand. I used to have the experience of sending a report which would say the government in Sarajevo did such and such, and it would appear as the Muslim-led government in Sarajevo did such and such, because that was the the generic shorthand that was used by media all over the world, not just in the West, but all over the world, to show the conflict in very crude terms. When I worked in Japan, I used to file stories, and if they didn't mention Bushido or samurai or the emperor, there was always a sense of, oh, it's not as colorful as it might be, when the reality is that those things are not everyday things in Japan. But I used to say, well, if you don't put it in the story, they'll find a way of putting it in the headline, so that they'll get that in. So the shorthand I think we use for countries and cultures that are far away, that is something that is done all the time, not simply in the case of former Yugoslavia. However, in the case of the conflict there, and I would draw a comparison to the conflict in Lebanon, it was presented as this very complicated conflict involving all of these parties. We have 3 or 4 familiar faces that we draw out, and people became familiar with certain names. But the underlying complexity of it was not communicated, again, because it's a very difficult thing to communicate. And what was communicated was a simplistic view, which I think is easy to put behind us. We think, yeah, they were all fighting about some sort of ancient hatreds and so on. So I think that's maybe why there's been collective amnesia about that, when the reality was that the issues like the Spanish Civil War were about civil and civic government, about the right of citizens to have, to live in a society where their community was not paramount. And paradoxically, 30 years later, we find that the paramount importance of community remains one of the issues. In fact, it's been solidified since the end of the conflict.
But talking about shorthands, at the very beginning of your book, you described very precisely and clearly in just a few sentences what exactly was happening in Bosnia. I can't agree more. Personally, even if I was born there, that's exactly what happened in Bosnia. It's very simple. Why is it so difficult to understand that thing even today? Or it is just hypocrisy, Islamophobia, or something else? Because it is, as I see it is a very subject of your book. All characters are connecting somehow to that kind of hypocrisy. The journalist, the doctor from Britain coming to help a young boy, and everybody else is in some way victim to that kind of hypocrisy, which is very difficult to understand even today.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes out in the book is that very often the people who were trying to help or set themselves up as trying to help fell into that trap and either didn't fully understand or bought into the notion that people behaved in a certain way because of which community they came from. But I have to say that also in the book itself, I think I failed, because my original intention was to write all 300 pages without using the words Serb, Croat or Bosniak. And I didn't succeed. So I was trying quite hard for a long time not to use the communal shorthand, so that we simply saw the people.
That's why you use the word rebel.
And that was something that several people have said they really couldn't get on board with. It seemed to them inappropriate, and to offer a view of the conflict that was really quite eccentric. That's precisely why I used rebel and government. I was trying to avoid using the more obvious descriptions. And one of the things that I do think it may have to some extent succeeded in was to show that the rebels comprised people, or rather the community associated with the rebels is a broad community, many of whom did not sympathize with the rebels. And that was the point I was trying to get over, that just by calling a person one of those communal affiliations doesn't sum up their political view, doesn't sum up their their view on life or experience. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. This is something that inside former Yugoslavia people do understand, but outside I think is less well understood. But I used to also say to myself, how well do I understand the conflict in Lebanon? 15 years of civil war, round about year 2, I remember my own feeling of, I can't follow this. It's really very, very complex. Long after the war, I had an opportunity to visit Beirut, and it's one of the few cities where by the end of the taxi journey from the airport to the hotel, I thought, yeah, this is a really interesting place. This is an urban experience that I would really welcome. And of course, because you cannot sum up that fabulous city in terms of 3 communities that were at war with one another for a long time, because there's much, much more to it than that.
I like the characters that you created in the book, and I personally reacted negatively when I faced the word rebels, but in the context of the book, it works. It works. You really. It helps to understand, to get understanding of the story of the story world, which is the most important thing for a book. And the characters helps the reader to understand the context and the story world. I really like the character. It was a bit risky to have several characters in interaction, but I think I managed, and other readers managed to know them all. Especially character of Terry, who says in one line, if you can stop the war, you can save at least one person from the hell. This sounds like some religious or moral principle that she believes in. Then the character of Brad is very, very interesting. I recognized John Barnes, the real correspondent of the New York Times. So my next question is concerned with your work, with the character, with creation of the characters. How much did you model your characters according to real people, existing people?
I would say that in many cases, the character emerged from a particular individual. The central character of Milena, for example, emerged from someone whom I encountered who had a very similar experience to that, to the experience of the character in the book. The correspondence were some of them drawn from the various different characters that you would be familiar with from that period. I would say, I mean, you mentioned Terry and you mentioned Brad. Both of those are flawed characters. Terry realizes very quickly that she's not only unprepared, but she's woefully unprepared for the task that she set out to do, and that since it involves the life of an individual person, being unprepared is almost unforgivable. So that developed with the story. So I wasn't thinking, the character didn't emerge complete. And the character at the end of the novel, I hope, is a slightly different character from the one who began the novel. She's learned. And of course, one of the things which was, I think, a universal experience of people coming to help was to realize that, first of all, to help is quite presumptuous. Are you prepared to be helped? Are you prepared to learn from these people that you apparently feel confident about coming to give answers to? So Terry went through that experience. Brad had an experience in Sri Lanka, where I spent some time before I came to Bosnia-Herzegovina. And one of the things there I wanted to address was that, again, being a foreign correspondent, being a war correspondent, brings with it certain responsibilities and certain hard questions, because we were all familiar with the the danger of falling into a kind of war tourism trap, where you're there because it's exciting and it's almost a personal satisfaction, rather than to do a professional job that will have a result that's fairly positive. And I think Brad has to come to terms of having made a major mistake in Sri Lanka that involved a colleague being killed. Does he have the strength of character to do his job in Bosnia and Herzegovina in a way that is not self-indulgent, and in a way that is not aimed at his own redemption, because his own redemption is not the most important thing that's happening in the city when he's there. There are a million stories like that. So in both of those cases, I think the idea was to explore the character in a way that at the end of the novel, the character is slightly altered from the beginning of the novel.
My personal reaction to the book is that it is very, very accurate description of what was happening in Sarajevo in the winter in 1992, 1993, and it's very exacting. It's readable, and the best part of the book for me personally is coming from the fact that you managed to find beauty in that terrible situation in which Sarajevo existed during that period of time. I just while reading, I just noted some parts there. You describe Sarajevo by night, for instance, by very lyrical sensibility, and that's my reaction as a reader to the book. But tell me, what was the reaction to the book in general? How people reacted? How the people reacted to the book? Not only people who are concerned with Sarajevo and Bosnia, but generally people who read the book.
That issue that you raised, which is a good one, about using the terms government and rebel, that caused a considerable reaction, and my rationale for that was that my original intention was to stick only with those two labels and not to use the communal labels that are more familiar. So one reaction was a negative one because of that. Not always negative, actually. Several people said they could see that was the intention. That was people who are familiar with politics in former Yugoslavia. Likewise, people who are familiar with the story understood the significance of the names, so you could tell what a person was likely to be by the name that they had been given. People outside of that experience who wouldn't have recognized the names, who wouldn't have had an issue of government and rebel, in several cases drew attention to what you just mentioned. And to be honest, as someone who was trying to create a picture of the city, I was really gratified. There's a scene which I think you're referring to, where one of the central characters watches the snow falling, and she considers the different parts of the city where this snow is falling, and she sort of considers this in detail. I felt when I was writing that, and then afterwards, if I didn't do anything else, I had a great feeling of creative satisfaction to make that particular image of the city, because it was peaceful, it was beautiful, and it alluded to something. I visited Sarajevo in 1991 before the actual siege began, when I was on my way to Dubrovnik, and I was grateful for that opportunity, because I remember the trams, the sound of the trams. I remember that was my introduction to Bosnian coffee. And I remember that everybody was smoking, and there was always music in the background, always sort of Yugo rock. And that scene of Sarajevo, I was a little bit trying to say this was a beautiful place, and it can be a beautiful place. As a matter of fact, even in this, it is a beautiful place. So that actually, I was pleased when several people who do not know the city actually said that was an image that stayed with me.
How did you get all Bosnian names? Milena, Yusuf. Did you ask someone for help or?
Well, my first advisor, not only in literature, but in everything else, including living in Bosnia-Herzegovina, is Maria. So I had a lot of...
It was my guessing. Okay, let's say a few words about your other books. What you are writing is crime fiction. Do you agree with it?
That's an excellent question, because one of the issues with both The Art of the Assassin and The Figure in the Photograph, which are the two crime novels set in Glasgow in 1899, 1900, is where do you place them in terms of the publishing niche? And I would say crime fiction. I would hold my hand up and immediately confess that I am also trying to have some consideration of more fundamental issues, the meaning of evil, the meaning of justice, the degree to which individuals have free will, or whether they're victims of circumstances and victims of things that happen to them. And I think also unintended consequences from people trying to do good things. Now, several of the criticisms of both novels, generally positive criticism, but several people have observed there's a great deal of description and it's quite slow. And I think, well, yeah, because that was the description and the philosophical considerations were actually part of my intent. What I was trying to do was make the story sufficiently exciting that you'd want to read to the end and find out who the baddie was. But at the same time, along the way, you would have some interesting digressions into other issues. And you're much more of an authority on crime fiction than I am, so you can tell me if you think that is...
I can say it's my personal opinion that it is a crime fiction, but in a very unusual scenography and historical period. I would say it is the beginning of modernization that you treat in those two books that I read. It's the figure in the photography and the art of the assassination, and I think it's crime fiction. If you divide crime fiction into three dominant dimensions and genres, you have the master detective, the British tradition, whodunit with Agatha Christie, Sherlock Holmes, and everything else. You have a hard-boiled American tradition with Chandler, Hammett, and everyone else. And you have crime fiction of social consciousness, typical for Scandinavia. I would put you in Scandinavia, actually, when it comes to your literature. I mean, you are very close to how Scandinavian writers make crime fiction. It's always crime fiction with respect to genre, but there is always something more.
I was really pleased when you mentioned the third category there, the crime fiction of social consciousness. I agree. I'd be happy to be included in that category.
I have one particular question that I'm very interested in. It's the role of the photography, of the art of photography. I mean, obviously you know very a lot of photography. And how come? Where did that interest is coming from in the photography? Is it your work as a journalist or something else? Because the description of photography as an art form and photographer, the character of photographer are done beautifully convincing. They are very in a very realistic way.
I should say that I was really surprised that so many reviews spoke about the detailed description of photography, because I have to confess to being a fraud. When I was a reporter, I really did not. I worked for a business magazine for several years, and I had to take photographs of the people that I interviewed, and I didn't like doing it. And I knew photographers who thought, if you want a photograph, you really should ask a photographer. You shouldn't just take your own Instamatic and do the pictures yourself. So I didn't have any first-hand experience of being a photographer. And I've subsequently written a series of stories in which the person who investigates the crimes in the same period, 1900 in Glasgow, is a piano tuner. And in both cases, the piano tuner and the photographer, I don't have first-hand experience. I could kind of have a certain familiarity with both things, but by no means first-hand. And I found that quite liberating because I'm not familiar with this. First of all, I had to learn a good deal about it and do some research. But secondly, it was an unfamiliar viewpoint for me. So when I imagined what the photographer would think about and how he would look at things, I had to imagine from scratch. And I found that quite interesting. I was learning about these things as I was writing the story. In both cases, certainly in this case, the photographer comes from another country and he comes to Glasgow, with which I'm very familiar. I haven't lived there for more than 40 years, but I'm familiar with it. And in a sense, the photographer also is has the same function as a foreign correspondent. So he arrives, he has to learn the ways, the customs. He sees the society from the viewpoint of an outsider, and I find that interesting. I was trying to convey again in the figure in the photograph. The assumption would be that this photographer, who's Spanish but lived in Cuba, would understand the desire of the people of Cuba to be free from Spanish rule. However, in 1900, it struck me, maybe the people in Cuba would not have had that desire so automatically. And if you look at the experience of Spanish rule and influence from the United States, it's not black and white. There are nuances to that. There are nuances to the historical experience. So I was interested in that. And I was surprised when actually that got less attention than the detail of the photography. And I should also say that the photographic timer was just made up. I mean, that there isn't any sort of historical validity to somebody developing that type of photography. And one of the things about that, which I also found interesting was, and some of the characters note this, you're taking photographs of people and they don't know they're being photographed. How much of an intrusion is that? Is that an ethical thing to do? And the defense is, if we find the killer, then it's justified itself. But of course, in Britain today, you have cameras in every corner, and some other European countries are the same, and they're filming continuously. So there were ethical issues involved in the ingenuity.
They are always looking for murderers among us. Let us know what you do at the present. Can you tell us something about your present activities and the plans for the future? Are you going to write something new? Can you describe? Can you tell it what it is? What book are you working on?
I have just 2 weeks ago finished the second volume of a trilogy, and the trilogy will be called Revolutionary Shoes. The first volume is called Revolutionary Shoes, and it's set slightly later. It's from 1912 to 1915. And it begins in Mexico at the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. And it features a correspondent, an American correspondent, who then travels from Mexico to Colorado, where there was huge industrial disruption at the end of 1914. There was a strike in the coal fields in which many people were killed. The government brought in the National Guard. The miners were well organized. They had several unions working together. And at the time, it was by no means clear that the United States would not go the same way as Mexico and have a full-scale revolution. And that interests me because when we look at it from this perspective, we just, to imagine that in 1912, 1913, people in the United States imagined that they were on the brink of revolution, you're already looking at an unfamiliar kind of historical scenario, and that interested me. And the character then goes to Japan and China, and he finishes up in Singapore in 1915. And all of those places and all of those historical events interest me because in many respects, they're either forgotten or they're not generally very well known. The Mexican Revolution maybe less so, but that was one of the at the time. We think about the Russian Revolution, but the reality was the Mexican Revolution had a lot of the same issues and went on for a lot longer. And one could argue remained a revolution for a lot longer than the Russian Revolution did. And in Tsingtao, for example, at the end of 1914, in World War I, the Japanese fought with the British against the Germans. And the bombardment of Tsingtao, which was besieged by the Japanese with a small British expeditionary force, was the most intense artillery bombardment in the history of warfare until that date. The fighting on the China coast was more severe than the fighting in Europe for several weeks in 1914. And those kinds of historical eccentricities I find very interesting. And one of the reasons I find them interesting is, and my novel about the Greek Civil War explores this, it's horrible to be someone who is caught in a conflict that turns out to be World War II. But imagine being caught in a conflict that people have forgotten about 10 years later, and you experienced the same things. You were besieged, you were bombarded by artillery, you saw people being killed by snipers and so on. And yet, if people say
nobody cares,
nobody remembers. So that's something that that interests me, and that's part of the work that I'm doing just now. I will finish the third volume, I hope, by June, and that's quite an ambitious project. The novels are quite long.
Looking forward to reading it. And finally, a question for you as a resident of Sarajevo. How would you describe the current situation? Are you afraid that war will break out again?
I would say that the situation is more volatile than I can remember it since the end of the war, and that's certainly not good. I would say likewise that many of the arguments that one hears today are the same as in 1991, 1990, when people say, but it's in no one's interest to have another war, and nobody wants another war, and so on and so forth. And we found very bitterly, very tragically in 91 and 92 that despite the fact that nobody wanted another conflict could easily break out. I think the volatility is such that one has to be concerned about the possibility of an accidental event triggering a series of events, which then brings us to the position that we do not want to be in. I would conclude by saying that I hope wiser counsel will prevail, and that the present issue can be resolved in a way that, first of all, allows us to maintain the peace, and secondly, addresses the conundrum that everything we've spoken about just now observes the fact that the most important issue in modern democratic European politics is the integrity of citizenship, the rights of the citizen. And in Bosnia-Herzegovina, we have, as you very well know, a complicated system that's designed to ensure the rights of communities. Now, how do you square that? This preoccupation with the rights of communities with the absolute paramount importance of the rights of individual citizens, regardless of what community they come from. So I would hope that if we are to have a positive outcome from the present crisis, it would address that fundamental conundrum in politics in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But I certainly hope that we are going to see through the present crisis without any further degradation in the political situation to the point where we have conflict again.
Kevin Sullivan, thank you for being with us, and I wish you good luck with everything you do. Thanks,
Ian. Thanks very much. I look forward to seeing you in Gothenburg, and I hope I haven't spoken too much in it, too much length.
Bye-bye.